todos, bienvenidos al coloquio del día de hoy. Today we have Hye Young Kim from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. She received her PhD in philosophy at the Free University of Berlin and has taught philosophy at the Free University of Berlin and at the ELTE Budapest, and currently works as a postdoctoral research at the Institution with a project in intersubjectivity, and when she tries to analyze the problem of subjective and intersubjective consciousness from a different perspective by analyzing languages. So we're very happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here and having me here. Thank you, Sergio, for inviting me and organizing, and thank you so much. So I have to, as you heard just now, I'm a philosopher, and so I'm new to mathematics. So, so I'm here more to learn, so to say, and this is my work in progress. So I hope to hear from you a lot after my talk. And so this is based on my topological interpretation of time consciousness, which is self-consciousness, I argue, based on the not logic, not set theory by Louis Kaufman, an American mathematician, from whom I actually learned all this, and that's how I started, and we are working on it together right now. So this is about time and consciousness, and I will do I speak too fast? And you'll be able to read here anyway what I say, so it should be fine, I hope. So, for a long time, I believed that time must flow like this, without much doubt. But does it? What if time's arrow doesn't flow straight forward? What if it flows like this, in a nut shape? Then what is time? What do we understand by time? Is time different than my time consciousness? In other words, is there objective and subjective time? If my time consciousness refers to subjective time, what is objective time? Can I understand time beyond my perception of time? Lots of questions, right? Philosophers are to question, not to answer. Let's say now, it's not now, but that's when I wrote, 7:13 p.m., June 8th, 2012, 18, at Gándara, Paris, France, and it takes 30 minutes for me to get to Notre Dame, for example, from there. Is this objective time? I remember yesterday, for example, it's not yesterday anymore, when I was walking home in the rain and I think about what to have for dinner, the most important thing in life, in about 10 minutes. Is this subjective time? Or my childhood memory, or what I want to do in the future, is this subjective time? Here I take my time consciousness as time and time as my time consciousness. Then why time? Why time consciousness? If consciousness refers to the perception of the subjective experiences by an autonomous individual, consciousness is, or based on, time consciousness. And our time consciousness is spatial, or spatially structured. And this is an attempt to prove that the structure of time is not a straight arrow that flows forward. In doing so, I will show how an identical subjective consciousness is possible based on time consciousness, and reveal the necessary relationship between subjective and intersubjective consciousness. The problem of now is in the center of this discussion. Oops. So in my discussion today, I will deal with two knot models. One is trefoil, and the other is Borromean rings. And this is trefoil knot, and this is Borromean rings. A trivial knot is the simplest example of non-trivial knot, which means that it is not possible to untie this knot in 3 dimensions without cutting it. It is one seamless line, so one ring. And Borromean rings consist of 3 topological circles which are interlinked with each other. And let's name these 3 rings A, B, C. And they are woven in the way that the ring A surrounds ring C, and C surrounds B, and B surrounds A. And there are 6 crossings in this model where the 3 individual rings are connected and separated. And each crossing, the link between the rings, manifests the mutual relationships between the rings. And here I apply Louis Kaufmann's knot logic, which is a variant of set theory that allows mutual relationship. Kaufmann presents knot set theory as a diagrammatic alternative to Venn diagrams that models a non-standard set theory and explains its relationship. So like here, Venn diagram shows the possibility of a logical comprehension of the connective tissue in topology and geometry. Each marker where A intersects B and B intersects C is placed in 2 regions and indicate that at least one of these regions is not empty. Therefore, some A are B and some B are C. Kaufmann articulates its logical connection in relation to theory of knots and links in 3-dimensional space. Let's say that there are undefined objects A, B, and C. And a notion of membership is denoted as, like this. A belongs to B. It will be possible for A to belong to itself, or A belongs to B while B belongs to A. Objects will be indicated by non-self intersecting arcs in the plane, and a given object may correspond to a multiplicity of arcs, which will be labeled with a label corresponding to the object. And membership is indicated by the diagram as below. So there is an arc A, and arc A and B. And here, A belongs to B. Here we see that A belongs to B. The arc B is unbroken, while A labels 2 arcs, here and here, that meet on opposite sides of B, which represents that A passes under B according to the convention of illustrating one arc passing behind another arc by putting a break in the arc that passes behind. This pictorial convention is very important for the logic and the relationship with three-dimensional space. Kaufmann shows this with the example of von Neumann construction of sets of arbitrary finite cardinality that starts with an empty set and building a sequence of sets xn, like x empty set and like set of 1, set of 2, and so on and so forth. By using overcrossing convention for membership, one can draw a diagram of this construction like this.
The diagram means that you have your empty set first. That's the first.
Right.
Can you?
This is the empty set that we start with, and as you see here, it expresses the belongingness. So in this x1, the empty set belongs to this x1, and x2. These 2 belongs, and x3, these 3 belongs, and so on and so forth. It goes like that, and he just tries to show this in a diagram. point of this, showing this belongingness in a picture, like visualize it. And the three rings of Borromean rings mutually belong together, as I showed you before. And the crossings between the rings show their belongingness to each other. I marked the three crossing on the outer edge as A, B, C, and the inner as alpha, beta, gamma. At the crossing A, where the ring C is placed under the ring A, C belongs to A. Here. Ring C goes under A, ring A. So here, C belongs to A. And there is a membership relationship. And the mutuality of the three rings are as below at each crossing here. Like A, at the crossing A, C belongs to A, and B, A belongs to B, and so on and so forth. Okay. And the mutual relationship, membership relationship between different rings is as below here. For example, in the Borromean rings, where A belongs to B and B belongs to A. And these sets are the sets that are members of each other. But there are sets that are members of themselves as well, like this. A belongs to A. And these diagrams here below indicate sets that may have a multiplicity of identical members. And instead of regarding the multiplicity of identical members as all equivalent to one another, to condense them like, like this, Kaufman suggests another solution in which identical members cancel in pair. Thus, this set of A and A and A and A is an empty set, which looks like this, and it looks like this in diagram. And the rule, can I have some water? Sorry. Okay. And the rule of cancellation of identical members is fundamental to knot-set theory, as in the second Redmeyer move. And this is the second Redmeyer move, and I'm going to show you what the Redmeister moves look like. So these are the three Redmeister moves, 1, 2, 3. And a knot consists in a single closed curve, and a link may have many closed curves, and a tangle has arcs with free ends. Redmeister moves that proves that any knot or any link in three-dimensional space can be represented by a diagram containing only crossings of the type indicated as below. And the first Redmeister move allows the creation or cancellation in the corresponding knot set. But if the loop is a physical loop in a rope, the cancellation of the loop in the first move must be paid for by a corresponding twist in the rope, as you see here. According to Kaufman, one can regard it as an exchange rather than an elimination or creation of the loop. If this is applied to the diagram that represents a twisted band, the self-membership is not lost as we move to the topology. Quote, any knot set has a representative that is a member of itself, and the states of self-membership and a non-self-membership are equivalent. Therefore, a radical knot set is a member of itself, and only if it is not a member of itself. And this knot set gives a way to conceptualize non-standard sets without recourse to infinite regress through a twist in a boundary. The self-membering set is represented by a curl, where the observer on the curl itself goes from being container to being a member. And this shows that membership becomes topological relationship. And the same logic works in a Mobius band as well, as you see, where A is minus A. Kaufman shows that this self-membership solves also Russell's paradox. Let R be the set that contains all the sets that do not include themselves. If R contains itself, R does not include itself. But if R does not include itself, R should be a member of itself, right? This is the paradox. But we can resolve this paradox in the domain by having every set as a member of itself and a not member of itself. Through this. And so what is interesting about the two-dimensionalized model of the Borromean rings is that inside the Borromean rings, a trefoil knot is nestled. In the inner structure of the mutual relationships of the rings is a trefoil knot, as you see here, with the outer edges open. In a trefoil knot, there are three crossings as in the inner structure of the Borromean rings, alpha, beta, gamma. And this shows the self-mutuality because a trefoil knot consists of one seamless ring, I said. Therefore, a trefoil knot represents a stable self-mutuality in three loops about itself. So it just shows the membership as A belongs to A. And I applied this logic of self-mutuality, self-membership, to explain the consistency of a subjective consciousness throughout the change of time. So it works this way. How can a subjective I at each different temporal locus, A, B, C, be identical? Like I a minute ago, second ago, an hour ago, and I right now, and I like that's coming like in a second, minute, year, however, like time, amount of time, you name. Like how can I, like, is this really the same identical I? Like the same identical time, self-consciousness? So this means that different I's at each point of now is the same I with continuity on this. I at, like as you see here, we already did. And I at each moment has to be able to observe I at another moment, which as the observed is not the same I from the observant's point of view. Instead of these different I's, different I's conform to an identical I that understands this connectivity and the continuity between different moments. And I should explain more by putting a knot, a shape knot on this plane. So to see how this works more precisely, I will place the knot on a plane with axis of time and space. Let's say that green line, can you see that it's green? The vertical, indicate temporal, and pink lines indicate the spatial locations. By having a plane of both vertical and horizontal axis of time and space, we can understand that space consciousness, which is necessarily attached to my time consciousness. Time consciousness is always spatial. If time is perceived through change, which is caused by movements, it always presumes the space that is either the background of the movement to take place or the act of movement itself creates or results in space. A linear time consciousness that looked like this, just like one line of time, flow of time. Excuse me. Does not manifest the dimension of space on its single linear structure. But when we move, either actually moving our body from here and there, or reconstructing our memory from then, or like from then in the past, or pre-grasping of our future, like from now, we always necessarily locate ourselves spatially somehow, because we exist like spatially. When my time consciousness at each now is constructed through the modification of my memory and anticipation, it is impossible for me to recall my experience or expect the experience in the future without its spatial location, because these experiences take place. Now, I place a triple knot on this plane. It must look like this. And the point O here is now and here, where I stand right now. And I move. Time flows clockwise. Starting from O, the flow passes countless moments on the line, including P, Q, R, S, T. If we understand now as a point of now, which is O, here, and this is me at O, and this could be probably P, Q, R, can keep going. And from O, one sees oneself in different temporal and spatial locations. Like here, from O, I see myself, observe myself at the point P, which is not here and now anymore, but it's here and then. And at the point of Q, it's there and then, and R, there, back then, and so on and so forth. And by doing so, I locate myself. And this self-locating is crucial for self-awareness or self-consciousness, to know myself. That myself is myself. And the most interesting act of seeing actually happens at the point of O, here, now. And point of S, which is actually the same point as you see. It's overlapped. S is placed under O. And they share the same temporal and spatial location on this knot. And the act of seeing I, my present self, is the basis of the formation of selfness, as I said. In other words, I have to be able to see that I am there as I for me to be able to perceive myself as I. The I that is observed is I, but at the same time, not the I, the observer. So the subjective understanding of myself is based on the distinction of I and not I and its identity. So do you get it? Like at this point, at O, which is also S, O, the observer, and S, the observed, should be identical. It's the same I. But it's I and not I. And this is actually not my idiosyncratic idea. This is very common in philosophy, like especially Fichte, for example, in German idealism. Like he came up with this, I equals not I, which is the beginning of the knowledge of I-ness, like the knowledge of self. So, yeah, but so like I is not I. I as subject and I as objectified I. And I'm just trying to show how that works with this knot set theory on a knot. So This is what happens when one sees oneself at different points from where they are standing now, here, spatial, temporal locations. We can call this process modification. And again, this is not my word. Husserl used this word, but using Husserl's concept of modification, I'm just borrowing the word modification. And this is, however, not only the modification process of time consciousness, but the formation process of consciousness itself. And I say that this is what happens. I argue that this is what happens at this point. I mean, it's in German, but like Vorstellung means I imagine myself being here and there then. And Beobachtung, it's like I see myself being here and now. And Erinnerung, I remember myself being here and there back then, in the past. And I imagine this is what happens for me to form the understanding of myness or I-ness or self. And a trefoil knot as a whole is each moment of now in which there are different nows, the past and the future, different temporal and spatial locations, self-location, in a continuous structure. So this connection between nows at each now indicates the modification process, and this modification creates the selfness, subjective, of the consciousness. So conclusion one. One trefoil knot represents the modification of each now, point of time, and the generation of consciousness, selfness, is based on one's awareness of temporal and spatial location, which happens through the modification of multiple points of nows. My consciousness is therefore my spatial and temporal consciousness. And the mutual relationship in the Borromean rings between three different rings could possibly represent the mutual relationship between different nows at different subjects. My now, your now, her now, his now. Because we exist like interactively together. But traditionally, philosophically, it's been a very difficult issue to prove that my time consciousness is interacting with other people's time consciousness. Like, yeah, it's like so obvious, but like how? So let's see. I have already shown that the center of the Borromean rings forms a trefoil knot. And this trefoil knot in the Borromean rings has individual sides formed from two different rings that surround it. Therefore, in the self-mutual structure of the identical A, we can find the mutual relationships between three individual rings of the Borromean structure that look like this. And my subjective now is composed of different nows, not only mine, but I suppose also others. And at the same time, my self-mutual subjective now is placed in the heart of the intersubjective mutual now. The Borromean rings with a trefoil structure within itself manifest the fundamental and necessary relation between mutuality and self-mutuality, like how these knots are formed and like their relationships, self and intersubjective mutual relationship. So this is the second conclusion. The logic of mutuality and self-mutuality in the Borromean rings and the trefoil knot models visualizes the fundamental interrelation of the subjective self and intersubjective consciousness and their structure, through which we understand how we are aware of myself and others at the same time. Consciousness happens through the interaction of the perception of self and the perception of non-self, including other objects and observed self, not I. This double perception occurs simultaneously. So therefore, consciousness is self-consciousness. So let's talk about the plurality of nouns. Traditionally in philosophy, we have understood the flow of time as the line of points of now, a seamless succession of the now moments. Each now is believed to have its own plane that look like this. And on the plane of each now, spatial locations are marked. If time is to be understood as the fourth dimension that explains spatial changes, so my being here and now and that, and my being here and now, and my being there now and then, and so on. And then the flow of time is explained by connecting the points of here and there at each plane of now. And my memory acts as the mediator of connections, and that means the connecting lines between different points on this and that plane of nows. These multiple lines between different planes of nows can be crossed or paralleled, but these lines do not describe the backward or repeatable movements of temporal comprehension, modification of consciousness between the points which modify one's construction of time, understanding it as a flow. At each point of now, there can be multiple I's as the subject of time consciousness. I not only remember being just now or before a certain amount of time, but I conceive my being in the very next moment through my imagination and expectation. On each plane of now, there are countless points that represent nowness of my time consciousness. Firstly, different nows of different subjects, and secondly, different I-ness of the same subject on the same plane of now. In this context, I raise two questions. A, are the I's on the plane P and I on the plane P prime the same I? And can I be here and there at the same time? And if so, how? If the second hypothesis is true, there can be multiple I's of the identical subject on each plane. On the plane of time and space above, the point O and S represent the identical here and now, but at the same time, different here and now, because there is space for the active observation between the different points of O and S. I will come back to the space between O and S more specifically. And one might be able to regard each plane as each subject's plane of now. However, neither the multiplicity of now that are scattered here and there on the identical plane of each now, nor their interconnection between different planes is explained in the model with parallel planes of now. The problem of parallel planes of now is that on each separate plane, my understanding of now in relation to the past and the future, which is my continuous time perception of each moment of now, is not fully clarified. In short, here we ought to be able to explain A, how the planes belong together, and B, how multiple different points of now on a plane belong together. But what if the planes of now at each crossing would look like this? Maybe, if there's a plane at all. Like this. And a seamless string, continuous flow of time consciousness of an identical subject into these planes, and it would look like below. And there can be many, many of them because there are a great number of individuals. And if we see it from above, it would look like these tangled strings. And there are knots, there are crossings and links. And the links of these countless knots and their mutual relationships could be explained by Borromean space, which is connective space, like this. So, conclusion 3. The multiplicity of nows and their interrelations can be proven in the knots and their connective space, and time flows in the shape of knots. Maybe. And the connection between nows at each now indicates the modification process. And this modification creates the selfness, subjective of consciousness. The generation of consciousness, selfness, is based on one's awareness of temporal spatial location, which happens through the modification of multiple points of R. When we understand the temporal modification at each now between the past and the future in a knot form, we can explain different planes of now belong to myself, yet I don't belong to myself. And this act of self-observation generates space in itself. For example, in the model of consciousness, the space between the point U, which are the same present moment, is not explicable with parallel planes of now. Space between I and not I, and this space between I and not I, and this space is explainable through these links and their diagrams of knots, because links and their diagrams encode three-dimensional manifolds. The process of self-perception is always threefold, which creates three-dimensional space. So here, as I explained already, I observes, I see myself, and this process creates space. Although it's an abstract space, like the space of created by the act of our consciousness. But still, conclusion 4, time consciousness is spatially constituted and perceived. And this can be explained very well, like I showed you already, for example, on a Mobius model, where A is not A, and not A is A. And seeing myself, which is self, objectively, necessarily requires a third-person viewpoint. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Third-person viewpoint, even if it is, after all, only I who plays the third-person role by observing myself in the not I position. Self-observation is the process of self-othering, as the necessary relation of the mutuality and self-mutuality logic in the Borromean rings, and self-consciousness, which is subjective, is always at the same time intersubjective. For the intention of my self-perception is based on and points at my othered self. In this sense, the perception of my self-consciousness takes place simultaneously with my perception of not self, and vice versa. So, conclusion 5. The phenomenon of the necessary interrelation of the consciousness of self and the consciousness of the other is visualized in knots and their links, as seen above, because knots and links form a calculus that is inherently self-referential and mutual. And Kaufman has this interesting picture that he came up with. He has his knotted version of Wheeler's universe. And here you go, my version of knot itself. And this knotted consciousness is placed in the eye of the universe, Kaufman's knotted universe, that observes the meaning of the world. And I hope the riddle of identity and difference and subjectivity and intersubjectivity might have one variant of its answers, in knots and in knot logic. Like, why not? That was it. Thank you.